Narcissism. You hear that word thrown around all the time, right? To describe celebrities, politicians, maybe even your boss. But what does it actually mean? Well, beyond just a simple label, there's a really fascinating and pretty complex psychology going on. So let's dive in and really unpack the science behind it.
Here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll go way back to its mythical roots. Then we'll look at the two very different faces of narcissism. We'll explore that fine line where a personality trait tips over into a disorder, dig into where it even comes from, and finally, we'll tackle the biggest question of all. Can a narcissist actually change?
All right, so first things first, where did this whole idea even come from? Well, to really get the modern definition, we have to go back, like thousands of years back, to a classic myth that just captures the essence of it perfectly.
I mean, think about it. Long before anyone even dreamed of a selfie, the ancient Greeks and Romans were already telling this powerful story about a guy who was, let's just say, a little too into his own reflection.
And here's the story in a nutshell. You've got Narcissus, this incredibly handsome guy who rejects literally everyone who falls for him, including a poor nymph named Echo. But one day he sees his own reflection in a river, and he's completely smitten. He just can't look away from this perfect image, and eventually he falls in and drowns. And right where he died, a flower grows, the Narcissus.
That myth is the perfect setup for the modern psychological definition, which is, at its core, an inflated, grandiose self-image. Basically, it's the belief that you're smarter, better looking, and just flat out more important than everybody else. And that, of course, you deserve special treatment because of it.
Okay, but here's where things get really interesting. What if I told you there isn't just one type of narcissism? Psychologists have actually identified two very distinct faces of this trait.
On one side, you've got the type we all picture, grandiose narcissism. These are the extroverted, dominant people who are always seeking attention and chasing power. But then there's this other, much quieter type, vulnerable narcissism. These folks might seem reserved on the outside, but underneath, they have that exact same deep sense of entitlement, and they're incredibly easily threatened or offended. Now, regardless of the type, a darker side almost always comes out. Because everything is driven by self-interest, leaders with these traits can make some really risky, unethical decisions. In relationships, it can lead to things like dishonesty and cheating. And if you dare to challenge that perfect self-image, they can lash out with some serious resentment and aggression. Now, it's really important to remember that these traits, they exist on a spectrum. I mean, most of us have some of them, but what happens when they get so extreme that they completely take over someone's life? Well, that's when we cross the line into a clinical disorder. And this quote just hits the nail on the head when it comes to narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. It's described as a disease where the sufferers actually feel pretty good, but the people around them are the ones who suffer. That just perfectly captures the devastating impact it can have. So how common is it? Well, NPD affects about 1 to 2% of the population, and it tends to be diagnosed more often in men. And here's another key thing. This is a diagnosis that's safe for adults. You know, kids can be incredibly self-centered, but that's often just a totally normal part of growing up. So what's the tipping point? What turns these traits into a full-blown disorder? It's when they consume a person's entire life and cause major, major problems. I mean, a grandiose self-view isn't just confidence. It's believing the rules don't apply to you. A problem with empathy means you're just unable to connect with how others feel. You add in a bottomless need for praise and a huge sense of entitlement, and you can see how that would just destroy relationships and ruin opportunities.
Okay, so that naturally leads to the million-dollar question. Where does this all come from? Let's try to untangle the roots of narcissism, which, as it turns out, is a mix of genetics, our environment, and even the culture we live in.
Yeah, what is the cause? This is that classic nature versus nurture debate, right? Are people born this way, or are they made? Well, as we're about to see, the science shows it's a really complex dance between the two. All right, let's start with nature. And believe it or not, studies on twins have shown there's a surprisingly strong genetic component here. We might not have pinpointed the exact genes just yet, but it's pretty clear that our DNA plays a big role in predisposing someone to these traits. But, you know, genes are never the whole picture. Nurture, the way you were raised, your environment, that plays a huge role too. For example, parents who constantly tell their child they're a special genius might end up fostering that grandiose narcissism. On the flip side, parents who are really cold and controlling can sometimes contribute to the vulnerable type. And then you've got this bigger piece of the puzzle, culture. Research shows that in countries like the US, narcissistic traits have actually been on the rise since the 70s.
You can almost see it on a timeline, a big shift away from the community focus of the 60s, then into the me-first self-esteem movement, and now to our current culture of personal branding on social media.
And that, of course, brings us to social media. But here's a really key point. The evidence we have suggests it doesn't create narcissists. What it does is act like a giant megaphone. It's the perfect stage for people who already have these traits to get the status and attention they so desperately want.
Okay, so with all of this, the genetics, the upbringing, the culture, it sounds pretty set in stone, right? Which brings us to our final and maybe most important question of all. Is it even possible for a narcissist to change?
This is really the question that matters most, isn't it? Especially if you've ever had to deal with this kind of behavior. Is there a path forward? Can someone with these deep-seated traits learn to be more self-aware and connect with people in a healthier way? And the answer, maybe surprisingly, is yes. Yes, improvement is absolutely possible. But, and this is a big but, it is not easy. So, what does that path look like? Well, anything that gets a person to take an honest look in the mirror is a good start. That can include things like psychotherapy, and also just actively practicing compassion for other people, basically building up that empathy muscle that's been neglected.
And that right there brings us to the ultimate catch-22, which this final quote just sums up perfectly. To get better, you have to be willing to see yourself from an unflattering angle. But for a narcissist, that is the one thing their entire personality has been built to avoid. And that's the central, profound paradox that makes this such a complicated and honestly such a fascinating part of what it means to be human.